right, Mike. So, usually here on Art of Supply, we're talking to supply chain professionals, but you and I are connecting today at the place where supply chain and the law intersect. So, I think your background is going to be different than most of my guests. Can I have you start off by just telling us a little bit about certainly what you do today, but also how you got to this point?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Kelly, thank you so much. And thanks for the opportunity to be with you today, talking about an issue that you might not typically have a lawyer on your podcast, and I typically don't go on supply chain podcasts. So this is exciting for both of us. So I'm currently, Kelly, today, I am the Attorney General in the state of Nebraska. I've been doing it for a little over 2 years. Before that, I was in the legislature. I served 2 years as speaker, 6 years overall. And in my former non-public life, I started my own law practice. I'm an attorney by training. Obviously, I'm the attorney general. And I'm a small business owner. I was a small business owner. I built that firm from one lawyer, just me back in the day, to over 120 when I left. Actually, my wife runs it now. A little point of pride. It's the largest
Oh,
women-owned
interesting.
law firm in the entire country. So
That's fantastic. Well, congrats on that journey. And as you had said, no, I'm not usually talking to lawyers. Usually I pride myself on that, means I'm keeping myself out of trouble. Today, we're obviously talking about something very constructive, but you're not usually focused on supply chain. So you and I are connecting because you recently published an op ed in the Wall Street Journal that addresses the efforts by several groups to mandate the transition to EV trucking specifically, as opposed to sort of consumer EV vehicles. What was it that originally made this issue, which is front and center in supply chain, cross your desk from a legal perspective?
that's a great question. Well, first, the supply chain generally wasn't on my radar pre-COVID, really, Kelly. I mean, I think like most Americans, probably not you or your listeners, I think we took our supply chain, really running, high functioning system for granted. I think post COVID, it kind of got elevated in all of our consciousness. But hey, this is something that is subject to disruption. This isn't something that we should take for granted. And so it was a little bit post COVID, it was a little bit more on our radar because we are very concerned about our supply chain as consumers. In Nebraska, we're a big ag state, so well functioning supply chain is really important for us. We're also home to a really significant industry in Nebraska is the logistics industry. We have the largest stretch of I-80 in the country. We have a lot of great companies and a lot of jobs are reliant on the logistics industry here in the state. And we also were pretty focused on areas where powerful actors, whether they're state actors like, say, the state of California or the federal government or private actors, are trying to make really large or very significant policy decisions for us without our ability to weigh in. And so when you take all those things together, I can't remember the first thing that put it on my radar, but it certainly was something we were focusing on generally. And once you start digging into these regulations, I know we're going to talk about, it went to the very top of our priority list pretty quickly.
Well, I will say you're not alone in that learning more about supply chains going through COVID. And so I will say to you, welcome to the party. Supply chain is a fascinating space that sort of intersects with everything. But as you mentioned there, you're talking about the role that transportation logistics play based on Nebraska's location and geography. Now, in that article, you brought up a couple of really interesting statistics, some about how reliant the vast majority of the country is on trucking for receiving things today. But specific to Nebraska, you mentioned the fact that on Interstate 80, as you said, the longest stretch in the country, today, how many commercially sized EV truck charging stations are there?
For those of you listening, that's a zero. I put my hand up. There isn't one in the entire state of Nebraska, Kelly. Not one on I-80, which is where a lot of trucking traffic obviously goes through. But even on our other intrastate highways, not a single trucking charging station. And your listeners probably know, but many people, I think, who are not focused on the supply chain and the industry like you are and your listeners do not know, I think many don't know, is that a trucking charging station is not like plugging your Tesla into the wall in your garage. A trucking charging station might have enough power to charge a small city in the state of Nebraska. And so these things are really significant pieces of infrastructure, and we don't have a single solitary one. Because they're so big and complex and expensive, the idea of just throwing a bunch up to cover for EV technologies over the state of Nebraska is highly unrealistic.
Yeah. So the concern then here becomes one of readiness. And if it were just general readiness for the sake of progress in the transition towards renewable energy sources, right, maybe the timeline wouldn't be so much of a concern. But we're talking legally here because there are organizations looking to mandate not just this transition, but the timing of the transition, which starts to put a lot of pressure on a system, for instance, where you're starting from ground zero.
Completely right. I would say there's two significant concerns. The first one is somewhat a readiness concern,
Mm,
but I think there are so many issues, feasibility issues, that it almost becomes less readiness and more, is this even wise in the first instance? Because yes, certainly there are readiness concerns. How are you going to go to an EV future for our supply chain or our trucking fleet if you don't have a single trucking charging
yeah.
station in the state of Nebraska? And how do you go? How is it feasible to go from, say, a small handful, maybe a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand EV trucks to replace the over 10 million diesel trucks that exist on our highways today? That certainly is a feasibility question. But there are other questions that start to ask, hey, is this wise at all? How is our electrical grid, our charging infrastructure, not our generation infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, which is already under strain? If you go to California, they're rolling brownouts,
Yes.
and has continually increased pressure from data centers. We know AI is a significant power drain. With all of that, and then we're going to take our entire fossil-based trucking fleet and transform it into EV. So there is certainly feasibility, but it's at such an extreme that I do think the frame of the question is almost like, should we do this at all? But that's one question. It's really a policy question. The reason why we're involved as lawyers is because the process and who is determining the answer to that question, which is one that impacts all of us. It's essentially, as you know, Kelly, basically a nationwide policy shift. And the question that we're most interested in is who is answering that question. Because let's say Congress, elected representatives who we all get the chance to vote for, vote out of office, in office, we can lobby, we can try to persuade. If they all got together and decided this is what we want to do, I think that'd be a bad decision from a policy perspective. But they might have the power to do that under the Constitution. Here, that's not what happened. And I think that's not what happened because I don't think there'd be a majority support to do something like this. But instead, what we have here, Kelly, are really three powerful actors or sets of actors, none of whom are accountable to you or your listeners or to me or any Nebraskans. And those are federal bureaucrats, state bureaucrats in the state of California, and the OEMs, the manufacturing companies themselves, which of course are private and don't submit themselves to vote. So those are the three actors. And it's really for us, it's the process, it's the who deciding as much as it is the what that we're concerned about.
And not to leave anybody out, so you talked about those three actors. It makes sense then that the state of Nebraska has brought three cases, one against each of these different types of actors in this mandated transition. Can you give us a quick summary of who each of the cases are against and what the current status of that case is?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, there are three. The first one, we filed them all over the country. So we got just about every time zone covered. So we filed the first one in California, in federal district court. We filed that challenging CARB, as your listeners probably know, that's the California Air Resource Board. They issued a regulation called Advanced Clean Fleets that would essentially, over a very infeasible amount of time, would force trucking fleets that operated in California, which most want to, especially if you're in Nebraska and you want to ship, say, agricultural products to Asia, to basically go to an EV future. Those individuals of that board are not voted on by the public, certainly not by Nebraska. So we filed suit against them. That suit is still pending, so it's an active litigation, although part of CARB's or the individuals we sued, what they said initially was, hey, we think we can do this because California has a special status under the Clean Air Act, and we can get a waiver from the Biden administration. That was kind of their argument. We disagree with that, but nevertheless, that was their argument. That waiver request from California was actually withdrawn. So that case is still pending, but that was a very significant change for us in whether or not in our lawsuit. So we were feeling very hopeful about the ultimate success of that lawsuit. That's one. If we jump to the East Coast, we also filed a lawsuit against the EPA because the EPA issued, again, unaccountable bureaucrats in the administrative state, not members of Congress, issued a regulation basically getting to the same place. Essentially what could be described as an EV mandate, especially if you're doing it on the really restricted time horizon that the EPA tried to put forward. We had a coalition of states, 24 in that case. We had, by the way, 17, Kelly, that helped us file suit in California. 24 states filed suit against the EPA, the Biden era EPA over that regulation. That case also is sort of in the beginning stages. The Trump administration, obviously have had a change in administration, change at an attorney general. The new attorney general, General Bondi, has now been confirmed. The administration's got its hands. There are lots of issues, lots of regulations they're going to have to analyze. We're hopeful that as they look into this particular one, that they will rethink the Biden decision to really try to mandate the EV. So still active litigation. We're hopeful there. The third case is back in Nebraska, and that is a state court action. So the other two were in federal court. This is in state court in Lincoln County, Nebraska, North Platte for those. And if by the way, if any of your listeners are truckers and they do interstate work, I am certain that they have passed through North Platte. It's a great oasis on that I-80 stretch. And that one, we filed suit against the 4 major manufacturers of trucks in the United States, which collectively have almost 100%, basically 99 plus percentage of the marketplace, because they themselves wanted to agree under the Clean Truck Partnership with CARB to say, we will get to this EV future, even if, say, and they didn't mention us directly, but even if, say, in Nebraska were to strike down these regulations, they will take it upon themselves to drive us to an EV future, not let the market decide. And so we have alleged an antitrust suit. We basically said, look, you're an oligopoly. Those 4 control the entire market. Hey, you want to compete against one another? That's one thing. But agreeing to do this, that's another thing. And so that case is just getting going. And unlike the other two, where you have an administration change or a withdrawal of a waiver, this is a lawsuit against private parties. So that's in its earliest stages, and we don't know exactly how that's going to unfold quite yet.
Now, if we go back on your journey from West Coast to East, let's start with California. So California has this unique position because they were, and you can correct me on the details, but basically regulating emissions before the EPA started to do so. So California got this special carve out where they can make different rules, but if those rules are more stringent than what the EPA has for the rest of the country, they have to ask for that waiver. You mentioned we know we've certainly had a change of administration, and I think that's going to affect certainly, you mentioned AG Bondi, but also we've now got Lee Zeldin at the EPA. It's interesting that the justification on California's part for withdrawing that waiver was that they said they didn't believe it would be approved under the Trump administration. But I believe in terms of timeline, it sat for nearly, maybe a little bit longer than a year under the Biden administration and actually didn't get approved there either. And so maybe some signs that, there's concern elsewhere about the enforceability of this, because we know that a piece of what CARB has done in the past did get their waiver. So we have sort of this funny connection between advanced clean fleets, which you talked about, but there's also advanced clean trucks. And the fleets has broader scope because it actually has more of an impact on companies that are based outside of California. Now that did get its waiver. So advanced clean trucks got its waiver. And I believe, Mike, that means it's enforceable. It's both on the books and enforceable in California because of the waiver.
So advanced clean trucks. So we've got a mighty partnership with our neighbor to the east in Iowa, and General Byrd has been leading the charge against that particular action. So we haven't filed suit against advanced clean trucks.
Correct.
But there is a companion litigation on the East Coast with the EPA, I believe, over trucks to challenge that action from the EPA.
And those two are closely related. And that's actually
Mhm.
something that we will talk about. Before we do that, so California withdrew their waiver petition from the EPA, which leaves advanced clean fleets unenforceable. What would it have meant if that waiver had been received and if advanced clean fleets became enforceable?
It's a great question. So take a step. You had a great explanation of the Clean Air Act, why California has a special treatment, what waivers can mean. But getting a waiver would not have ended the fight in the first instance. So I want to be very clear because it's our
Absolutely.
position, even having a waiver. So the
Ah,
Clean Air Act deals with emissions. So we think about, maybe miles per gallon, things like that. It's our position that emissions are one thing, maybe a better technology on emissions from a diesel power or internal combustion engine based truck is one thing, but transforming the industry or transforming the technology from an ICE infrastructure to EV is actually not regulating emissions. So we would have said, and we fought the waiver. We were fighting the waiver. Actually, we led another coalition to fight the waiver. So even with the waiver would have been granted, we would have argued there would not have been authority, even with the waiver for California to do what they were trying to do. And beyond that, we would have argued, and we did argue. And if this were ever to come down in the future, say, let's say a new administration gives a waiver, they try it again, which is why, by the way, we're trying to litigate this case even without the waiver. We want to get to a victory or court victory so we can just settle this once for all. We would say this is not a constitutional exercise of California's state power, because what they're essentially doing is dictating for their state basically national terms of engagement on a marketplace. And you can't do that on train tracks. The state of Nebraska can't say that train tracks should be a greater width or a lesser width. That makes sense. We can't regulate the size of mud flaps in Nebraska. If you drive through Nebraska, there's a national standard. We can't just say it's going to be different. It makes sense when you have the interstate flow of goods. You don't want to have someone stop their cars, their train cars, when they enter the border and refit them somehow. And we think under that same constitutional theory, California could not have done what they did. So legally, the waiver itself would not have ended the battle for us. We think we had a lot of good arguments to still stop CARB's action. Practically speaking, if it actually did ever heaven forbid, Kelly ever actually got into and was being enforced, because I think it would have it was already starting to have a dramatic impact on companies and the uncertainty of how do they invest their resources? Do they need to go start buying EVs? The manufacturers, we heard anecdotal reports that manufacturers were starting to tell people, hey, if you want to buy something from us, like an internal combustion engine truck, you've got to maybe think about buying EVs too. It would have been incredibly disruptive for the marketplace and our logistics companies, even years out from its final termination date.
Yeah. Now you make an interesting point about this sort of being stuck in between as the transition starts to happen. And that's an incredibly sensitive place for companies and people determining strategy and timing purchasing decisions to be. I have to be honest, being in the business world, I find it really hard to have the patience for the legal system. It's not a complaint, it's just an observation. So these things take an extremely long time, right? And just like you talked about, we don't want people stopping at the border of Nebraska and needing to change the gauge on their rail cars. There is something about that intersection of pace around business planning and strategy and how the wheels of the legal system turn. And of course, there are safeguards built into that. There's a reason that it's not done at high pace. Can you give us any sense in the business world of how we should think about the timeline of all of this unfolding? So there are plans that need to be reviewed. There are waivers that are being reviewed. There are open comment periods where people get to speak. How should we think about this time frame in terms of all of the different things that are going on and the plans that we're going to have to start probably putting in place in parallel? If this, then that, and if this other thing, then that other plan. How should we be thinking about that from a business standpoint?
Well, it's an amazing question, and it's such a critical question, especially when it comes to supply chain and logistics, because the investments you're talking about, Kelly, not just in light of time, are millions, tens of millions of dollars with long-term time horizons. As a former business owner myself, I know our system works best when you have clear rules that are stable and durable, on which you can make sound long-term investment decisions. So I am right there with you. By the way, if you'd like to make me king for the day, I probably could resolve all this
You could move
pretty
it along
quickly.
for us. Yeah.
Which is another reason, by the way, why we need to make sure, and we need to sort of culturally put pressure on these agencies and other political powerful actors to make sure that these hard questions are put through the political branches or the free market. Because in either of those two places, you and your members and your listeners all have the ability to sort of participate and understand the timing. And when we're in this gray zone where people are trying to take it upon themselves to decide national topics, that is where we get into big trouble. So what I can speak to is really the legal timing.
Sure.
I'll take each of our three cases. The California case, all three are ongoing, and these are, I feel like I need to make like an SEC equivalent disclaimer. This is not legal advice. This is not a legal representation. You sort of never know exactly how a case is going to unfold.
Absolutely.
The California case, I think the withdrawal of the waiver, I think we should expect this might be one of the fastest of the cases to be resolved.
Okay.
Certainly, I think withdrawing the waiver is a significant waiving of the white flag, at least the near-term white flag from California. They've acknowledged they need the waiver. They don't have the waiver. They withdrew their request for the waiver. So I think at least that, now the case is still being fought. I think that one is on a much shorter time horizon and one where you can make some predictions, at least in the near term. I think the EPA, it's still a little uncertain until the Trump administration has the chance to review it and weigh in, given President Trump's statement on the executive order, when he issued an executive order on unleashing American energy and sort of his dim comments, I think, on EVs. We're hopeful, but I can't speak for the administration. They haven't signaled one way or the other, but we're hopeful that EPA under Lee Zeldin, as you mentioned, who I think has a lot of common sense. I've been very impressed with him. I think we're hopeful that one could be resolved as well, maybe on also a short-term time horizon. So I think when you're talking about suing these unelected regulators, I think we're on a shorter time horizon. Would I say 2025? We're early in the year, so decent chance, good chance that we see some resolution on those. Can't guarantee it, but I think good chance this year we'll see some resolution. The one that is difficult to predict is the state court case, because that is filed against private actors. And as your listeners are going to know, Kelly, as you understand, that court case, it could take a long time if you want to get it to the judge. And then we alleged antitrust we had antitrust causes of action. So those are really fact intensive often and can take a long time.
Yeah.
If it's left for the litigation process to unfold, that is years. Now we are hopeful that with the zeitgeist shifting post-election, feels like some common sense is entering the room, and it's kind of a vibe shift in this space. We're hopeful that the defendants in that case, the OEMs, will sort of read the room as well and maybe shift what it is that they're going to do, but we can't guarantee that and we can't control them. So that's the one that I'm least able to predict, but hopefully maybe there's pressure from their customers or others saying, what are we doing here? Let's go back to competing against ourselves in the free market and not trying to dictate national policy in a highly contested area. And let's leave that to Congress or the states.
Yeah.
And, so I don't know, but I'm hopeful that maybe something earlier could break than later.
Yeah. Well, and it is interesting too that you mention certainly the switch of administration and what we've heard so far coming out of the Trump White House. Usually you don't have to do a lot of guessing to figure out where the Trump administration stands. This, to me, maybe because I care about it more than the average, is one of those places that falls in between. They've been very clear about not supporting personal car EV mandates. To your point, they've been very clear on energy policy, right? Leveraging every single source of energy we have access to in this company. I'm still waiting, Mike. And I'm watching for that message of connecting those two in my mind, which is, okay, now let's talk commercially. How do we feel about those mandates and that transition? It could be he's going to wake up tomorrow, and that's going to be the topic du jour. Watching for clear signals there. But to your point, I think we can sort of extrapolate in a couple of these different areas and get a sense of where we're headed.
Well, on that, Kelly, I would say I agree with you. I mean, I don't think we've seen public, and I think I remain pretty hopeful given the administration's public comments. Also, the focus, Secretary Bezin just the other day talking about really focusing on the long tail of interest rates, which is really an anti-inflationary fight. We have to get a handle on inflation. There could be no greater sort of threat on inflation, I think, than trying to force feed this EV transition to greater threat to inflation by really transforming our supply chain the way that these people are trying to propose. So I think given all of those things, their public statements and the rest, I agree with you. I remain hopeful. I think it's going to happen. The thing that I think is important and why your podcast is so important, the work you're doing is so important, what we're trying to do, yes, we are trying to win legal fights, no doubt. That's my job. But what we are trying to do is raise this issue in the level of the public consciousness, because people they think about maybe supply chain more today than they did, say, 2019.
Yeah.
But it's not front and center in the same way that other issues are, whether maybe it's personal EVs or some of these other issues. And so what we're trying to do is just beat the drum and really spread the message and really get people aware and open their eyes to what is happening. Because when good, clear-eyed people look at this and they immediately say, what I think is just like, oh my gosh, we're trying to do what? This doesn't make any sense. This is a terrible idea. How do we put a stop to this? And so I just think it's probably more of an issue that you've got great people in the supply chain who are doing great work every day, hauling goods across the United States or focusing on their piece of the supply chain to make sure everything runs right for the American economy. And I think that level of sort of humility and focusing on the work is hurting us a little bit now, because I think we want more people to be aware of sort of this issue that's impending. So I think it's almost a little bit of a public relations, or just like not a public relations issue, but it's just not quite yet top of mind for people. But I think when it is, good things will happen.
Well, and I do think that's the benefit of you and your team, and certainly any of the states that have collaborated with you on these cases, looking at this from a 30,000-foot level, because absolutely, we're all focused on that box, that truck, that distribution center, right? Moving things along. When you step back and, for instance, so we've talked about the Clean Truck Partnership, where you have these major manufacturers who have all signed on and said, even if advanced clean fleets is ruled as unenforceable or ruled as illegal, we're still going to move ahead from a manufacturing and an equipment standpoint. People in supply chain might hear that and think, well, why on earth would they do that? Or, oh, gee, that's going to be a real pain and we're going to have to change our plans. But you and your team look at that legally and you say, but wait a minute, if we have multiple major manufacturers all agreeing to do the same thing, it takes away the spirit of competition that is supposed to be at the base of our system. And that means antitrust, because if they were all acting individually, you'd have manufacturer A saying, I'm going all in on EVs. I don't care. I'm going all in. And somebody else might look at the landscape and say, there's our open door right there. And we don't look at these conditions and necessarily think that is classic right down the middle antitrust, but you're looking at it from that higher level perspective and saying, whoa, systemically, this is something that needs to be responded to, which I think is where it's, whether it's a PR issue or an education issue, I actually think it's a wonderful thing that now supply chain operationally and the different groups of states from a legal standpoint are considering these things systemically and from each other's point of view.
So well said. The fact that we have so many states, I think, is just reflective that this is a national issue. But for those people who might be just supply chain curious, who are listening to your podcast today, think about what would happen if, say, tomorrow, every oil company in the United States or every gas station in the United States got together and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to stop selling as much gas. We're going to restrict the supply of gas, because eventually maybe we want to get into the electric vehicle business, which will mean, of course, that our prices will go up. But because we're all colluding together, that's, no one will have to be able to go to a different gas station if they see prices lower, because there'll be less gas, and we know, Economics 101, prices will go. Everyone would be up in arms. Everyone would be up in arms.
Yeah.
That's really exactly what's happening here, because it is not, as I said, 99% of the manufactured trucks come from these four manufacturers. And so, to your point, Kelly, if one of them wanted to rush off, and I'm a big believer in the free market. If you can out innovate and provide a better customer experience and more customer value, go for it. I'm all
Absolutely.
in. But what would happen if someone did EVs? They're not popular. They're far more expensive, and they don't go as far, carry as much payload. So when you start to look at all the boxes, no one's going to buy them right now. Very few people will, and these companies will lose money. And you don't get around that free market problem by saying, aha, let's just all get together and agree that we will do this together.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't work in the gas station context, and it doesn't work in the manufacturer context either.
Yeah. Now let me ask you this, and this is something I know enough about the legal world, is that it's very literal. Right. And sometimes there needs to be interpretation, right? That's why we have the different levels of courts. But typically you can look at something and it's very specific one way or the other. So this Clean Truck Partnership says that whether advanced clean fleets is approved, gets waivers, becomes enforceable, goes ahead, or whether it is ruled as not enforceable, they are still going to go ahead with this transition. Now, what I hear in there is a middle space. What if advanced clean fleets get stuck in a funny middle space where it neither has the green light to go ahead nor the red light to completely make it stop? As an outsider, that sort of feels like where we are right now without this EPA waiver. Does that create a third lane that wasn't charted in advance? So where somebody could say, well, obviously we were going to go ahead if it was approved. We've committed to going ahead if it were slapped back. But since it's neither, maybe we'll find a third way and say that we've changed our minds and maybe we don't want to do this partnership anymore. And you want to weigh in on that? Is there a third space there, or is that sort of beyond the way that you're looking at this case?
Well, first of all, I hope I get to know supply chains as well as the law, Kelly. I want to be an honorary member of the Art of Supply podcast. I think the way you describe these issues, I got to applaud your creative mind. It's a good question. We haven't seen that yet. They haven't really taken a legal position yet in our lawsuit. We understand there's going to be, they'll look to dismiss the suit. I am very supportive of any way that they would like to get out of that particular agreement. However they want to get out of it or tear it up, I think that's important from a legal perspective. To your earlier point about it, but from a practical perspective, sort of touching on your point earlier about how do you plan for the long term, unless these things are killed, it's really hard as a business to say that they're going to go away. And so I think
Right.
is there a gray zone legally for them to get out? I hope so. Hey, I'm willing to co-collaborate with them to find a way for them to get out of the partnership. We think they ought to just tear it up and walk away. But from a practical perspective, that's why it's so important for us to continue the fight, say, in California, even if they don't have the waiver, because we need certainty. You need certainty. Your listeners need certainty. Business owners need certainty. For us to get certainty, we can't just say, CARB, you're not going to enforce this now, so let's just walk away. We need court orders. We need agreements. We need things that are enforceable. I think it's both and, but we are more than willing to help any of those defendants get out of that agreement, however we can.
Now, to your point about certainty, I'm actually going to apologize on behalf of supply chain because I think we've been part of the trouble here. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm only speaking for myself, but I'm pretty darn sure that I'm not the only person that thought this. So we start to hear all of the mandates and things about the transition to EV trucking. Most of us that have been in the space look at it. You do like some little back of napkin. This many trucks, this many chargers. Okay, but the payload's not as much. Okay, but there's only so many hours a driver can drive, and now you need a 5-hour charge cycle in the middle. You don't need too many hypothetical scenarios to start to think, I'm not so sure this is going to work. But those of us that are in supply chain, I think we all thought it is so obvious that this is not going to work on this timeline at scale. Something, air quotes, something is going to swoop in at the 11th hour and save us. And I think a lot of people have been taking a wait and see. Some people have been sticking their heads in the sand. Other people have been like, well, I'm going to let the bigger guy go first and let him figure it out, and then we'll learn from them. I think that's part of this certainty issue too. And so my question back to you from a legal standpoint, I almost think of your Wall Street Journal op-ed as saying the quiet part out loud. We've all been thinking it. We've all been worrying about it. Maybe we've all been thinking, oh, but they're never going to enforce it. Sure, it'll be on the books, but they're never going to enforce it. But legally, when you're thinking about the process of how this is supposed to work, why is it so important to not just ask the questions and say the quiet part out loud, but then take the steps that are within your scope to make sure that the regulations that are on the books line up with what we're all expecting to do operationally?
Great points and great question. I think hopefully at this point, seeing how the world's unfolded over the last 4 or 5 years, everyone, whether they're listening to your podcast or not, is disabused of this idea that all of the rational, smart outcomes are going to be the things that will come to pass, especially if it's part of my own industry that I know really well. And of course, like I can see the obvious stupidity in some of these things. And so I'm sure others will. I think no one should think that anymore. And I think anyone who's listening to your podcast should assume that without action or someone standing up, bad things are going to happen. And I think your question is really critical because it identifies one of the dangers of the approaches that these powerful state actors are going to have. Think about the three, we talked about the lawsuits. Think about the three sets of actors we have sued here in Nebraska. One is CARB. Well, CARB is a pretty significant regulator in one of the largest economies of the world. If you're a trucking company or a logistics company doing business in CARB, you are going to think twice or three times or more than that before you take on a legal challenge to your regulator. Same thing with the EPA. And same thing also with these truck manufacturers. They control the entire market. And so it is critical for trucking or logistics companies, supply chain companies to stand up and share their expertise. It would be amazing if some of them, and some are, get up and file the lawsuits, work through with their associations to sue. Unfortunately, when you're taking on powerful actors, there's some reasonable, rational disincentives to filing those suits, which means it is all the more important for state attorneys general in particular. We truly are, and I'm not overstating this, in these cases, often the last line of defense and the only entity that has the ability, has the lawyers, have the resources, so long as we have the political courage and know the issues are there to stand up and fight. And that's why, going back to one of your first questions, Kelly, how did this come to my desk? Well, I know as it came to my desk, I had a lot of people that I knew and trusted in this space that I could go and talk to, and they were willing to share their expertise and educate me on how bad these issues are. And so going forward, what I'd encourage everyone on this podcast who's listening to be vigilant, to assume not good things are going to happen, but assume when bad ideas come that the bad ideas are going to come to fruition unless some positive action is taken. If they can take that positive action themselves, amazing. If they can collectively organize with their other private groups or through their association, amazing. But if they can't do those two things, work with your governmental stakeholders, establish a relationship with the Attorney General's office, whatever state you're in. If you're in Nebraska, reach out to us and start to make sure that the people, because there are not as many people as you would like to think who can stand up and fight for some of these industries. And maybe the most prominent are state AG. So establish those relationships, do it early and often, get the trust, let people know that you're a trusted truth teller who's just caring about the right thing and not just trying to, do something for your own personal corporate benefit. I'm not saying, of course, anyone who's listening to this podcast is not them, but that in this world, you want to make sure you look for trusted truth tellers who have the industry's best interest at heart. And that's the recommendation I would give to people, because you can't assume good things are going to happen, unfortunately.
No, you definitely can't. Mike, this has been absolutely fascinating. I loved the piece in the Wall Street Journal. I'm glad it's you that's in charge of that big long stretch of Interstate 80 in Nebraska, because clearly you're willing to take this issue on and say what needs to be said and follow it up with action. I think as my parting question for you, how do you recommend that people stay on top of this, right? Because we're all going to go back to tracking trucks and moving boxes in just a minute here. But if we want to keep a little bit of that 30,000 foot perspective in mind as we go about our work, how can we stay up to date on either these three cases or the work that CARB and the EPA and the manufacturers are doing that absolutely intersect with the business and the operational things that we're trying to do day in and day out.
Oh, that's great. Well, first, I'm guessing most of your listeners did not put the boxes down to listen to this podcast. They're
They
probably doing well.
probably did not.
These are hardworking
Yep.
Americans who are doing great work around the country. I would say first they should subscribe to your podcast. I mean, you're obviously on the cutting edge. Leverage those alternative media sources that are focused as experts on these issues. Because if I know, Kelly, if you're going to see updates on these, I'm sure it's going to weave its way into some of the work that you're doing. So I would say
Definitely.
do that. If they want to follow our office on Twitter, they can go. It's at any attorney Jen, NE for Nebraska. It's not NB. A lot of people think it's NB. No, it's NE attorney GEN. And as we have updates in our lawsuits, you can be certain that we will post them and those on Twitter, which is where we do our press releases. And hopefully we will make it, if we do our job right, we'll make it a little easier for them to find out what's going on, because whether it's the Wall Street Journal article or this podcast or other things that we're doing, I'm trying to get the story told of the logistics industry and our friends in the supply chain who are doing such amazing work for Americans every day. We're doing our best. So hopefully it'll be easier and easier, and it'll get into that sort of public discourse in a way maybe it wasn't 6 months ago. But start with those two places. And I think any local association is probably the last thing I would say. Whether it's California or Nebraska or somewhere else, there's some great associations that are really following these issues. And I'd encourage people to look to become members of those associations.
Awesome. Well, Attorney General Mike Hilgers, I appreciate so much you taking time out of your schedule to have the conversation with me. We are absolutely going to make use of these resources to stay on top of it. And we look forward to hearing the news that breaks next.
Kelly, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. And for all of your listeners on the supply chain, I'm a dad of 4 children. Let me just thank you on behalf of our family for all that you do to keep our supply chain running. It's a critical part of our national economy and the success of so many businesses and families all around the country. And I'm just very grateful for the work that they do. So thank you so much.